There's a question that philosophy created in that once you hear it, you can no longer ignore it. Not because it's too complicated to understand, but because it's simple enough to fully understand, and yet impossible to answer without something inside you feeling wrong. It is a dilemma that exposes the deepest contradictions in human morality, which reveals that our most basic ethical instincts contradict each other, and that no moral system that has ever been created can resolve them satisfactorily. This dilemma has a simple name: the trolley problem. Imagine you are in a control room. In front of you, there's a lever. Outside, on a railway, a runaway tram advances at high speed towards 5 people tied to the tracks. These 5 people will definitely die if you don't do anything. But if you pull the lever, the tram will divert to another track, where there's only one person tied. That person will die. The 5 will be saved. What do? This is the basic version of the trolley problem, created by British philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967, and later developed by Judith Jarvis Thomson. At first glance, the answer seems obvious. 5 lives are worth more than 1. You pull the lever, save 5 people, and 1 dies. Mathematically, it's a win. Most people, when faced with this scenario, say they would pull the lever. And that makes sense. Within a consequentialist logic, which judges actions by their consequences, pulling the lever is clearly the right choice. The result is the best possible within the available options. But now let's change the scenario. Just one detail. This time, you're not in a control room. You're on a bridge over the tracks, looking down. The runaway tram still approaches the 5 people. But there is no lever. The only way to stop the tram is to throw something heavy enough onto the tracks to stop it. And on his side of the bridge is a large man, a stranger. If you push him off the bridge, his body will stop the tram. He will die. The 5 people will be saved. The end result is identical to the first scenario. 1 person dies, 5 survive. Do you push the man? Something extraordinary happens here. The vast majority of people who said they would pull the lever now say they would not push the man. The result is mathematically the same: 1 life in exchange for 5. But something changed, and that something is the heart of the most disturbing dilemma ever created by moral philosophy. Why does pulling a lever that indirectly causes someone's death seem acceptable, but using your bare hands to push a person to their death seems completely unacceptable? What changed between the 2 scenarios? The math is the same. The result is the same. But our moral response is radically different, and this difference reveals something deep and disturbing about how human beings actually construct their morality. Let's think about this carefully. One of the most tempting explanations is the distinction between killing and letting die. In the liver scenario, you're deflecting a threat that already existed, redirecting something that was already underway. In the bridge scenario, you're using a person as an instrument, as a means to an end. You're turning a human being into a tool to save others, and that, for most people, feels like a violation of something fundamental. This intuition has a philosophical name. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century, formulated what became known as the categorical imperative, and one of his most famous formulations reads as follows: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, and never merely as a means. In other words, people are not tools. Every human being has an intrinsic dignity that cannot be violated, even if doing so would produce better consequences for others. This Kantian perspective explains why pushing the man seems wrong, even if it saves more lives. You would be using that man as an instrument, as an object, reducing his existence to a useful weight to stop a tram. And this, according to Kant, is fundamentally wrong regardless of the outcome. But wait, let's follow this reasoning and see where it takes us. If we can never treat one person as a means to an end, then Kantian logic would lead us to let the 5 people die in the lever scenario as well. After all, by pulling the lever, you are using the death of the person on the alternative track as a means to save the 5. You are taking advantage of that person being on that track to create a solution to your problem. Wouldn't that also be using it as a means? Kantian philosophy has answers for this, sophisticated answers that distinguish between intended effects and predicted effects, between what you choose as part of your plan and what only happens as a collateral consequence. But these answers quickly get complicated, and many philosophers feel that they do not conclude the argument convincingly. On the other side of the debate are the utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the great founders of utilitarianism in the 19th century, would say that morality is simple. You should always act in a way that maximizes well-being and minimizes suffering for the greatest number of people possible. From this perspective, pulling the lever is right, pushing the man is right, because both result in 1 death instead of 5. The math is what matters. The method of how we arrive at the result has no moral relevance in itself. But here's the problem with pure utilitarianism. If we follow this logic rigorously, we arrive at conclusions that practically every human being finds horrible. Imagine a doctor in a hospital with 5 patients who urgently need organ transplants to survive. One needs a heart, one a liver, one a kidney, and so on. In the hallway, there's a healthy patient who has come for a routine checkup and whose organs are compatible with all 5. The most basic utilitarianism would say, kill the healthy patient, remove the organs, save the 5. 1 life in exchange for 5. Same math as the tram. Almost no one accepts this. Almost no one would say that the doctor should do this. And the refusal is not unreasonable. It is the revelation that there is something in our morality that goes beyond the arithmetic of lives. There is a principle that certain acts are wrong in themselves, regardless of the result they produce. Killing an innocent person to use their organs is wrong, even if it saves 5. And this principle, which seems obvious when put in these terms, directly conflicts with the purest utilitarianism. The trolley problem was designed exactly to expose this tension, to show that our moral intuitions are inconsistent. That we accept a certain mathematical logic in the lever scenario, but reject the same logic in the bridge scenario without being able to fully convincingly articulate why the 2 cases are different enough to justify opposing responses. Judith Jarvis Thomson, who delved into the problem in the 80s, was one of the first to notice this inconsistency in a systematic way. She spent years trying to find a morally relevant difference between the 2 scenarios that would justify our intuition that pulling the lever is right and pushing the man is wrong. And although she found several candidates for this distinction, none of them were completely convincing to the entire philosophical community. But the problem doesn't stop there. Philosophy likes to tighten the screws, to push a dilemma until it shows all its fractures, and then variations arise. Imagine now that you don't need to push the man with your hands. There's a trapdoor in the bridge. You just need to press a button, and the trapdoor opens, and the man falls onto the tracks, and the tram is stopped, and the 5 are saved. Now, would you push? Most people still say no. But more people falter than in the hands-pushing scenario, and that's fascinating. Because the only difference between pushing the man directly and pushing the button is the physical distance between you and the act of killing. But this distance seems to make a moral difference to us. This raises a disturbing question. Is our morality, in part, a matter of how we physically feel about an act and not just abstract reasoning about consequences? If so, what does this say about the validity of our moral intuitions? Can we trust moral judgments that depend on factors as contingent as the physical distance between us and the consequences of our actions? These questions have become even more urgent in the modern world. Military drone pilots kill people thousands of miles away by pressing buttons on computer screens. Soldiers make decisions that result in civilian deaths without ever seeing the victims. Artificial intelligence algorithms make choices that affect millions of lives without any individual human making a clear, conscious decision. The trolley problem, created as an abstract thought experiment, has become a very concrete question about how technology transforms our moral experience. But let's go back to the original dilemma, because there are still layers we haven't explored. Here's a variation that tends to cause even more discomfort. What if the person on the bridge was not a stranger, but a criminal convicted of multiple murders? Many people who said no to pushing start saying that, in this case, they might push. What changed? The math is the same. The 5 people remain 5 innocent people. But the value we place on the life of the man on the bridge has changed based on his moral story. This reveals that deep down, many of us do not. We believe that all lives have exactly the same value in all circumstances. We believe, at least intuitively, that certain choices and actions can increase or decrease the moral value of a life. And this is extremely delicate philosophical and political territory, because inconsistently applied, this type of reasoning has been used throughout history to justify atrocities. What if the person on the bridge was an elderly man with a terminal illness who only had 6 months to live? Most people are still hesitant, but more people are leaning towards yes. 6 months versus 5 full lives. But who decides what a full life is? Who has the authority to make this calculation? And again, when you start making these calculations systematically, you get dangerously close to ideologies that have judged certain categories of lives as less valuable. The trolley dilemma is so powerful precisely because, by tightening the assumptions, it forces us to confront these tendencies that are often hidden beneath our highest moral discourses. Let's now turn to a variation that philosopher Peter Unger developed, and which he called the loop. Imagine the 5 of them on the main tracks. There's a variant of the trails that forms a loop, a circular detour that eventually returns to the main trail. A person is in this loop. If you pull the lever, the tram will swerve into the loop, pass the person there, kill them, and the weight of their body, along with the impact, will stop the tram before it returns to the main track where the 5 are. Would you pull the loop lever? Here, the distinction between using someone as a means and simply redirecting a threat collapses. In the loop, You're clearly using the person's death as part of the mechanism that saves the five. Her body isn't just a side effect. It is an essential component of the solution. And yet, for many people, this seems more acceptable than pushing the man off the bridge, perhaps because it still involves pulling a lever rather than direct physical contact. What this reveals is that our moral psychology is deeply influenced by factors that have little real logical relevance. Physical distance, direct contact, visibility of the victim, all of these factors affect how we judge the morality of an act, even when the logical structure of the act is identical in different scenarios. Moral neuroscience research, especially studies conducted by philosopher and neuroscientist Joshua Green and his team at Harvard, has shown something fascinating. When people contemplate the lever scenario, the regions of the brain associated with logical reasoning and deliberative planning are the most active. When they contemplate the man-pushing scenario, the regions associated with emotion and responding to direct threats light up much more brightly. In other words, the two scenarios activate different brain systems, which is why our responses seem inconsistent. They are produced by different modules of our psychology. Green argues that this suggests that our moral intuitions are not a transparent window into objective ethical truths. They are the product of evolutionary processes that were shaped by environments radically different from the modern world. Our horror at physically pushing someone to their death likely evolved in contexts where direct physical violence was the primary form of interpersonal harm. But that horror doesn't consistently transfer to more abstract ways of causing harm, like pushing buttons or making political decisions that affect millions of people. This raises one of the deepest questions that the trolley dilemma forces us to face. Should we trust our moral intuitions? If these intuitions are the product of evolutionary processes that were not designed to deal with modern moral dilemmas, if they contradict each other in systematic ways, if they vary with morally irrelevant factors like physical distance, then on what basis should we build our ethics? One answer is to say that we should simply ignore intuitions and follow reasoning. Calculate the consequences, maximize well-being, and execute the plan regardless of the discomfort we feel. This is the position of the most rigorous utilitarianism. But this position takes us back to the doctor who kills the healthy patient to save five, and most of us cannot accept that conclusion. Another response is to say that intuitions have real moral weight, that they represent the distillation of millennia of practical wisdom about how to live together, and that when a philosophical argument leads to a conclusion that profoundly violates the intuition, we should reject one of the argument's premises rather than accept the monstrous. Philosophers call this tolensing the ponens. Instead of following modus ponens, forward logic from premises to conclusion, you do the reverse. The conclusion is obviously wrong, so something in the premises must be false, but this path has its own danger. Using intuitions to reject arguments can easily become an excuse to never change your mind, to always find a way to protect what we already believe. And the history of human morality is largely the history of expanding the moral circle against the dominant intuitions of each era. The intuition that slavery was natural and acceptable was dominant for millennia. The intuition that women should not have political rights was shared by the vast majority. If we had always followed our intuitions, we would never have progressed morally. The trolley dilemma, therefore, places us in a position of profound epistemic discomfort. We cannot simply follow reasoning without intuitions, because this leads us to conclusions that seem monstrous. We cannot simply follow intuitions without reasoning, because this can trap us in prejudices and historical errors. We need to somehow navigate between these two poles, use reasoning to question and refine intuitions, and use intuitions to question and limit reasoning. But no one has a clear recipe for how to do this. There's yet another dimension of the problem that is rarely discussed, but which I find one of the most revealing. The trolley dilemma assumes that you are the agent, the one who decides. But what if you were one of 5 people on the tracks? Would you have the right to demand that someone push the man off the bridge to save you? Would you have the right to demand that someone kill an innocent person for your benefit? Most people answer no to this question, which reveals something profound about the difference between what is morally permitted to do and what is morally required. Even if it is permissible to push the man to save 5, and even this is disputed, this does not mean that the 5 have the right to demand this service. And this distinction between permission and requirement is fundamental to understanding the structure of moral rights. But now reverse the situation. What if you were the man on the bridge? Would you have any obligation to voluntarily jump in to save the 5? That's a martyr. And most people agree that it would be extraordinarily noble and admirable, but not morally demandable. No one has an obligation to sacrifice their own life to save others, at least not under normal circumstances. But then we return to the original question. If the man has no obligation to sacrifice himself, and the 5 have no right to demand sacrifice, then what exactly is the moral standing of someone who decides to push him? Is this person doing good? Are you committing a crime? Are you exercising power that does not belong to you? Criminal law in virtually every jurisdiction in the world would say that pushing a man is murder. Regardless of your intention to save the five, you deliberately caused the death of an innocent human being. And the law generally does not accept the defense that you killed someone to save others in cases where the victim was not directly threatening others. The man on the bridge was not a threat. He was simply an available resource. This reveals a fascinating tension between morality and legality. What is legally wrong can sometimes be morally right, and vice versa. And the trolley dilemma is one of the places where this tension is most acute and most difficult to resolve. There's a final version of the dilemma that I want to explore, one that the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson called the case of the transplant surgeon, and which connects the trolley problem directly to medicine, bioethics, and public health policy. The surgeon has 5 patients dying, each needing a different organ. There is a healthy patient. The surgeon kills the healthy patient, extracts the organs, saves the 5. Wrong? Almost unanimously, yes. But now imagine there is an epidemic. The government has a vaccine that saves lives, but it has a rare side effect. In 1 in every million cases, it causes the death of the vaccinated person. If you vaccinate the entire population, you will kill a few people to save many more. Wrong? Most people say no, that's acceptable, but the logical structure is similar. You're causing the deaths of identifiable people to save a greater number of people. The difference is that in the case of the vaccine, you don't know in advance who will die. Death is not intentional in the same sense as that of the surgeon. It's a statistic, not a person. And again, our moral psychology responds very differently to statistics than to concrete individuals. A famous study showed that people donate much more to save a specific child with a name and photo than to save thousands of children represented by numbers. This has enormous implications for public policy. Decisions that statistically kill some people to save many others are made days in public health, transportation infrastructure, food regulation. The speed limit on roads means that some people will die in accidents that could have been avoided if the limit had been lower. Drug approval implies that some patients will die from side effects that have passed through the regulatory filter. These are real everyday versions of the trolley dilemma, and we accept them because the statistical coldness makes them psychologically tolerable in a way that the surgeon's case is not. The trolley problem, ultimately, is not just a philosophical conundrum. It's a mirror. He shows us that our morality is built on foundations that are not as solid and coherent as we would like to believe. That our intuitions, however strong and universal they may seem, contradict each other in systematic ways. That no ethical system that has ever been created can handle all of our intuitions at the same time without generating conclusions that we consider unacceptable. This does not mean that morality is illusory or that everything is relative. It means that the task of building consistent and coherent ethics is much more difficult than it seems. It is a work in progress that humanity has been doing for millennia and is far from finished. And dilemmas like the one about the tram are essential tools in this work, not because they give us answers, but because they show us with surgical precision where our theories and intuitions fail. When you feel that discomfort, when you imagine pushing the man off the bridge, when you realize that you can't completely convincingly justify why this is different from pulling the lever, you are experiencing something that few things in life make us experience: the limit of your own moral understanding, the point where the map ends and the territory continues. And it is precisely at this point of discomfort, this zone of inconsistency, that the dilemma illuminates that the most honest and necessary philosophical work takes place. It's not comfortable. It is not satisfactory, but it's real. And in a world that constantly offers us easy certainties and simple answers to complex questions, there is something profoundly valuable about a question that refuses to be answered easily. That keeps us awake, that makes us think, that reminds us that the moral life is serious, that it is difficult, and that none of us have yet reached the other side with completely clean hands.